Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Focus of today's video is how to make the most out of your budget when building a sim rig. So we've had prior videos recently that have focused on how to get the most out of your graphics settings. We've talked through just overall hardware setup of the rig, monitors, cabling, seating position, etc. But something else that I've learned a huge amount on over the last 2 to 3 years as I've added and upgraded my rig is where it's a smart place to maybe allocate a bit more of your budget and where you can definitely make some savings. So it's not going to be a buying guide in the traditional sense. There's not going to be any advice comparing one brand to another, etc, etc. Will from Boosted Media and many other YouTubers do a really good job of talking through the different brands, different qualities, etc. that are available and out there. But what I really wanted to focus on is more of a spending guide. So I'll talk through all of the components of the rig, cockpit, seat, pedals, wheelbase, etc. And I'm just going to give you my experience in terms of where I think it's worth spending more of your budget, where I think you can save some of that budget, and then I'll just talk you through some of the mistakes that I've made over the years, certain components that I've had to upgrade, every 6 months to a year just because they didn't really fit the long-term view that I had of the build, and a couple of places where I made some pretty smart decisions early on, the cockpit and seat probably being the best two examples. So let's get into it. We're going to start off with what I think is probably the most important part. Might not be the most sexy, but that will be the cockpit. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the cockpit. Unlikely to be the most exciting part of your build, but it is probably the most important. It's going to be where if you get it right and you spend the money in the right areas early on, it can last through every single upgrade that you might have planned for your rig, with the maybe exception of motion. But even then, you could probably plan for motion super early on if you thought that was a route that you were going to go down. But if we just break it down in terms of, what are the sort of cockpits that are available, and if you are just starting out, what are some of the key decisions that you're going to have to make? So I'll talk from experience. My first time sim racing when it was, off a controller was TV, playseat, PlayStation, and a basic set of wheels and pedals. And that was great. And at the time, I thought that's all sim racing was really going to be. I kind of liked that I had a racing seat, I was in front of the TV, and that was cool. But lo and behold, I went down the rabbit hole pretty quickly. And of course, ended up selling that playseat and the peripherals that I had with it probably within 6 months. So I think what's really important when you're starting out for sim racing is just trying to identify, which can be difficult right off the bat, is this going to be a super casual hobby where you're never going to move away from just running on your flat screen TV and just, basic wheel and pedals? Or do you have a bit of a passion for it? And, even if it took you 3-4 years to get all of the kit that you really want, but you can see yourself kind of migrating to a purpose-built sim rig cockpit. Now, if it's the latter, the good thing about rigs nowadays is there's quite a bit of selection actually. So when I started out, I had the playseat initially, then I moved to the SimLab GT1 Evo, which is sat behind me. And there wasn't a huge amount of selection 3-4 years ago, but it was starting to get much better. Now, because there's more competition, there's more selection, the starting price for an aluminium profile rig is not too terrible. It's something that you can consider, and a playseat, to be honest, I think in Canadian they're anywhere between $300 and $500, and for probably another couple of hundred you can get into the aluminium profile type setup that I have behind me, albeit basic, but obviously much better build quality. The reason why that is super important is playseats and some of those sort of temporary seating solutions, temporary cockpit solutions are good, but they're not particularly versatile and they are not great for if you are going to build out your hobby. They tend to be limited in terms of the wheelbases and pedals they support because they're just not stiff enough for the higher forces, and it's difficult to bolt on extra bits and pieces to them. So My recommendation in short, when it comes to looking at various cockpits, try to see where you might get to in the future with sim racing. And if you think there's any possibility at all that it could become something that you really do spend a bit of time in, then take a look at aluminium profile rigs. Obviously look at new ones. There's plenty of competition out there now, and they're fairly widely available in, probably the country that you're in. However, check the second-hand market, because really aluminium profile rigs are just pieces of aluminium that you can really just bolt together, and it's just kind of like adult Lego. So there's no reason to need to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on a brand new top of the range aluminium profile rig. What you're really looking for in a rig is stiffness and versatility, and something that is going to fit your kind of upgrade path 2 to 5 years in the future. So, should you spend or should you save when it comes to cockpit? Well, in my view, this is one where you could allocate a bit more funds, but not in order to get the absolute best aluminium profile rig with all of the extras, etc., but to maybe lift yourself out of the play seat type budget and try and get into just a basic aluminium profile rig. Because if you do that, you're going to save that upgrade path mistake that I went through, where I started out with a play seat, had some fun for 6 months, realized it wasn't going to cut it as soon as I got a better wheelbase, and then had to transition to aluminium profile. If you start with aluminium profile, you're pretty much just going to be set for the future. And sure, you might have to buy different pieces to bolt onto it if you change wheelbases, change pedals, do different things with your monitors, but the frame of the cockpit is just going to be good to go forever. So yeah, I would spend more here, but as with everything, there's no need to go crazy. But if you can stretch the budget to get into aluminium profile, that could well save you money further down the line. So next up, the seat. Now, I do think most people probably do give a little bit of thought into the seat that they are going to put in. I suspect most of us have the same challenge though. How do you test the seat out? Where can you go? It's not like a sofa shop where you can just jump in, try 20 different types, decide on the one that fits the best, and off you go and take it home. I know for me, certainly, I just bought this off-spec, almost certainly off Amazon a couple of years ago, trying to remember. Of course, I did a little bit of research, but I didn't know for sure exactly how the seat was going to work out until I actually had it in my rig and got sitting in it. Here's some things that you absolutely must do just to make sure, especially if you can't try the seat out beforehand. Take your measurements and be really rigorous about the personal measurements, and also just make sure that the rig that you have has the adjustability to fit the seat. If it's aluminium profile, it almost certainly will. But things like, do you have the right brackets? What brackets does the seat need? Are you going to have the adjustability with the bracket, with the seat, to get that tilt angle that you'd like to sit in as you're racing? So really take the time to do those research, understand the fittings, understand the brackets that you need, and have a good look at your sim rig. Take the measurements just to make sure that it will fit. I would say the one key thing, or probably the most important thing in terms of measurements, would be obviously width. There's going to be nothing worse than having a racing seat that's just pinching you in the hips and is too narrow. So really take a good look at that. And a lot of racing seats tend to be more on the narrower side. This Sparco seat is fairly narrow. I don't have particularly wide hips, so this does fit me well. But when other people jump in and try, honestly, if they're any wider than me, it's not the most comfortable seat for them. It works okay for me, and I did take my measurements, but it's probably right on the limit, actually. So that's really important. Shoulder measurements, worth taking a look at that, because most racing seats are going to have a little bit of kind of shoulder support, which is great. You should be in the right position, but of course if the shoulder supports aren't in the right place, that can be a real pain. So do the measurements, make sure you get a good understanding of whether that fit's going to work, And then also just kind of the underneath the top half of your leg, that support from the seat's going to be super important, especially on longer races. So you just want to make sure that the measurements from the underside of the top part of your leg is going to be really well supported by the seat that you go for. In terms of whether to spend or save, let's be honest, you're going to sit in this thing for hours upon hours upon hours. And it's a little bit like the cockpit. You could spend tons and tons of money on a seat, you know, side headrests, back boosters, whatever. There's all, you know, this is the way the companies kind of push the seats up in price, is just by adding extras on. All that really matters is comfort for you, fit for you as a driver, and then adjustability for the rig. And you can get all of that in, honestly, some of the most cheapest racing seats out there. So spend, but only spend up to the level that you need to get the comfort, the fit, and the adjustability that you need. Do better pedals make you faster? That is a question posted every couple of days online, various forums, iRacing, ACC, etc. And the short answer to that is yes, but only up to a point. So it's an interesting one in terms of a spending guide, of whether you can save or spend, because a little bit like wheels, there's this huge range that manufacturers now put out in terms of the really basic pedals that you can get bundled with a belt-driven wheelbase, no load cells, anything like that, to medium level where you're in the sort of hundreds of dollars range, but you're only getting pedals, but you're getting a load cell on the brake pedal, so you get a little bit more accuracy, all the way up to Simucube active pedals, even to hydraulic pedals that, you know, the manufacturers are truly trying to simulate, you know, the feeling of a real brake pedal by using hydraulics. So just like almost everything in sim racing, this can be a spending black hole. But let's just talk through the key elements that you need to think about in order to get the most out of your pedal set, depending on the type of sim racing and the level that you're trying to get to. If you're a beginner, getting that entry-level set where you're going to get a set of pedals that comes bundled with a wheelbase and steering wheel, there is nothing wrong with that at all. You know, that gets called out a lot of times of like, you know, they're just no good. But if you are a casual racer, you've got a play seat, you're playing in front of a TV, maybe you're just playing Gran Turismo and you're not doing it competitively, they just give you oodles of fun. There's nothing wrong with that. It's how I started out, and I spent a long time having huge enjoyment from racing, you know, with that sort of a setup. But there are limitations. So when we get into pedals specifically, if you're going for a really basic set that doesn't have a load cell, really the only control you have over how much brake is applied is how far you're pressing that brake pedal down. And it doesn't matter if it has all of the travel in the world. As humans, we're much better at modulating based on pressure rather than distance when it comes to pressing on the pedals. So the reality is, if you have any idea that sim racing will become at least an interesting hobby where you want to be a little bit competitive, you know, unless you're a Max Verstappen, a Lewis Hamilton, and have unbelievable, you know, pedal control, then moving to something with a load cell in the brake pedal is going to make a big difference. Because in a load cell, it is measuring the amount of force that you're pressing on the brake pedal, and you can build muscle memory on force that you're applying much easier than you can on the distance that you're pressing. So getting into the load cell brake pedals is probably the right thing to do. Not saying you shouldn't stick with the beginner set, but really that's only going to be good for as long as you're just doing super casual racing in front of a TV. Moving to a brake cell, load cell on the brake pedal is a good step forward. So, do you spend or do you save on pedals? I'm going to say that you save, which is going to sound a little weird given that I open this up by saying that pedals can make you faster. And I think the reason why is because the high end of pedals has got so crazy recently with these active pedals and the force feedback in the pedals from Simucube, that it becomes this black hole where you can spend thousands and thousands of dollars. But at that level, they're not really going to make you faster. In my mind, you know, the load cell, going from no load cell to load cell, is going to make a big difference, allow you to be more consistent, and therefore should allow you to become a better sim racer. Going from a decent load cell up to semi-cued active pedals, is that going to give you as big an improvement in terms of skill and consistency? I personally don't think so. I think having a pedal that takes the level of force that you kind of want to apply and the level of realism in terms of braking force that you're shooting for, and a good quality load cell, that's all you're going to need. And then that could last you forever. These Husingvel Ultimates, yes, they were high end at the time. There's plenty of better sort of pedal sets out there now. I can't imagine I'll ever change them. I've got used to how they feel. They give me great control. It's a very natural feel that I've got accustomed to over the years. And again, just like the Cockpit, just like the seat, I can't imagine I'll ever swap those out. So it's an area that you can save on, but just be aware, if you don't go load cell, you're definitely going to lose some of that braking fidelity. So if you can get into that load cell market, great. There's huge competition. There's lots of different manufacturers now that play in that space, tons of good reviews online. And therefore, for the price point that you want to spend on a set of pedals, there should be plenty of options with a load cell that are going to fit your budget. Onto the wheelbase. This is an interesting one. I think most of us, when we first got into sim racing, were drawn to wheelbase and wheels. They're the things that you touch, they look exciting, they have newton meters of force. They are very well marketed in the sim racing world, and so it's very easy to just be drawn into the wheelbase and feel that that is the most important thing. It's the thing I'm going to hold, it's going to give me the force feedback. I got to get this thing as good as I can afford it. And I don't think it's quite as simple as that. As we've said already, seat, cockpit, absolutely outrank the importance of the wheelbase, especially today when there are so many different brands, different options that are out there. But there are some things to consider when you're thinking about the wheelbase, especially if it's the first one you're going to buy. First of all, what is your cockpit? Your cockpit has got to be strong enough to take the forces that your wheelbase is going to put out. And so if you're looking at a direct drive wheelbase, then you almost certainly would need an aluminium profile cockpit. Not 100%, there are absolutely cockpits out there that can deal with some of the forces on the lower end direct drive, stuff that's kind of under 10 Newton meter. But if you're looking at anything that's 15 Newton meters, 20, anything above that, you're going to want a really strong and sturdy profile rig that's going to be able to handle those forces without any flex. So I think that's the first thing. And that, of course, is going to have some indication of how much budget you're going to spend. Now let's talk about direct drives just for a second. When I started out about 2-3 years ago, there were direct drive wheels, but there weren't tons of them on the market at the time, and they were considered really in the high end, so they were quite expensive. Fast forward to today, tons of direct drive wheels out there and a huge range of direct drive in terms of forces that they put out. So I think that's probably the most important part, is getting a sense of, okay, how important is that level of realism from the strength of the force feedback that I'm going to get from the wheelbase? And that will dictate to a large degree the money that you're going to spend and potentially the brands that you're going to look at. If you're going for absolute immersion, absolute realism, then you are going to be looking at a wheelbase that's going to be putting out probably a minimum of 20 Newton meters of force, and that is going to take you immediately into the higher end of the wheelbases that are on the market. Do you need that to have a fun, immersive, and sort of accurate force feedback experience? Absolutely not. Anything that's in the 5 to 10 range can do a really, really good job. You're just not going to get some of those maximum forces, but the fidelity of a direct drive wheelbase is still fantastic at those lower force levels. Now let's say you're also considering some of the more budget end of the spectrum, so you're not looking primarily at direct drive. You've got the belt-driven wheels, Thrustmaster, Fanatec, and there's other brands that play in that space. The pros of those wheelbases, fantastic value. If it's going to be nothing more than a TV hobby just for a bit of fun, I think a belt-driven wheelbase is great. You're going to get some force feedback, it's going to be fun to drive, and and it's going to be at a fantastic price. And you can also very often get those wheelbases with pedals thrown in, and so it's super, super competitive. And on top of that, you do not have to buy a super flash and stiff aluminium profile rig in order to kind of run that wheel and pedal combination because the forces they generate are quite low. However, what you need to bear in mind is if this is going to be a hobby that you really get into, then you will have some limitations with belt-driven wheelbases. The sort of accuracy, fidelity of the force feedback that you feel is not on the same level as direct drive. So you will miss information, or it won't be as clear to you the information that the sim is trying to deliver to you through the force feedback. So it's a little similar for me in terms of the guidance for the Cockpit. If you think this is going to be a reasonably serious hobby, really take a look, and can you stretch to a direct drive wheelbase? And of course, that's going to mean you're probably looking at an aluminium profile rig. So can you stretch to both of those? And if so, fantastic. You know, they should set you up for kind of a long-term setup for Cockpit wheelbase that should last you a long time. My perspective on this one is save, but if you can, try and get into the lower end of the direct drive wheelbases, just because of the big step up in quality and force feedback information that you're going to get through those versus the more basic belt driven wheelbases. Right, onto wheels. This is a simple one, save. But let's talk a little bit more about why that is the case and why it is so easy to overspend on wheels and just give them a way higher level of priority in your sim rig than what they actually should be. You know, let's break it down in terms of simplicity. Yes, you're going to hold on to the wheel all the time, but it doesn't make you faster, you know? It is basically just a mechanism to turn, and it is as simple as that. You know, it's not like pedals where, you know, there's levels of different quality in pedals, and that braking feel that a load cell can give you in the brake pedal can really make a difference. The reality is steering wheel just turns left and it turns right. As long as it attaches to the wheelbase, then that's really all that it needs to do. There's some argument around level of flex. So yes, lower end wheels, you could maybe get a little bit of flex if the materials are on the cheaper end, if they're more plasticky, hard plastic type wheels. And if you have a powerful wheelbase, of course, that's not going to be a great combination. But in general, you know, here are the things to think about when it comes to a wheel. So number one, yes, does it fit your wheelbase? Of course. If you've already got a wheelbase, that's key. The reality is you can generally get adapters now that can connect any wheel to any shaft. And if the wheel just has a fairly standard, I think it's 7 screw or 8 screws on the back, it's basically no worries to find adapters to get them to fit any particular wheelbase. So that shouldn't be an issue. We've talked a little bit about flex, but in reality, the real key thing would be buttons. That's what I think is the most important, as well as the actual size of the wheel itself. But if you talk about buttons, you'll know, based on the type of racing that you do, how many buttons realistically do you need to have a good experience? Are you racing at night? Are you racing in the rain? Do you need radio buttons? Do you need traction control or ABS buttons because you're changing those? Do you need rockers to change your brake balance? You know, if you're doing a lot of, say, like me, GT3 racing, then those are all functions that I use quite a bit. I'm also on Discord, I'm also streaming, so I want buttons to be able to mute my microphone and mute kind of some of the background noise. And so for me, having a wide range of buttons is key. Now, you'll see here, I've got buttons that also light up. That's also something that's quite important for me. When I'm racing, especially if I'm doing endurance racing, I often have the room quite dimly lit, just because I prefer to race in those conditions. And therefore, having lights or backlit buttons just helps me quickly see which ones I'm pressing if I don't quite have the muscle memory yet for, say, pit limiter, lights on, whatever it may be. But that's a big selling point, and it's a big marketing push for wheels these days, is just how many buttons and button combinations you can make. but you only need as many buttons as you're going to actually use whilst you're racing. So think through that, and if you don't have any sim racing setup, then just kind of have a look and think, well, how many buttons do I realistically need? Never hurts to have more, but typically, you know, the more buttons on a steering wheel is just another way for manufacturers to charge that little bit more. So just be aware of that. Now, wheel size, I think this is really important. When I started out sim racing, I started to buy different size wheels, thinking that if I was Formula racing, I'd want a nice narrow wheel to get that immersion. If I was GT3 racing, I'd want a wheel a bit more this size, you know, because that's what they do in real life. And then, you know, I didn't run a ton of oval, but when I did, I had a huge deep dish oval wheel, because again, I was going for realism. Now that was all good fun, and I enjoyed that for a year or so when I had that gear. But over time, what I really realized that I needed is just one wheel that kind of does everything. It's a bit of a compromise, you know, it's not as narrow as a Formula wheel, it's maybe not as big as an oval wheel, but it can do everything and it can do it fine. So I don't have to be swapping wheels, I'm just jump in the rig and I'm ready to go. Really all you need to think about would be, can you make it work with the wheelbase that you have? Is it the right size? You know, is it going to be a malleable size that you can use across different sims, different titles, different cars? And then does it have sufficient number of buttons and paddles to kind of cover 80–90% of your driving conditions? And if so, great. And it does not need to be on the super high end. You know, it feels great, high-end wheels, don't get me wrong, but it's a very easy way to dump a lot of money in. And to be honest, if you're working on a bit of a budget, sinking that extra money into, you know, better pedals, a more comfier seat, a aluminium profile rig, you're going to get way more value out of those in the long term than you are by having a wheel that just has more buttons or more lights or multiple wheels to suit multiple racing scenarios. So this will be a big area to save on. And for me, I now really look at wheels as luxury items. And I do love the high end, don't get me wrong, but that is what they are. They're high-end luxury items, but you can make huge savings on them by just getting a wheel that's going to suit the needs for your particular racing scenarios. Monitors. This is a really interesting part of the sim rig setup. I don't know whether people undervalue this. I think probably when I started out, I did undervalue the importance of monitors, which seems silly, given that's obviously the visual part of the game. It's what you're seeing, etc. If you've got a fancy PC, you know, all of that is just to generate the image that's on the screen. But there's a lot of complexity when it comes to monitors, and then the challenge with that is as you learn more about monitors, about the technology, screen sizes, G-Sync, FreeSync, just about everything, it means it can be a slippery slope in terms of upgrades. Now, it's not simple, I don't think, to class this as an item to definitely spend or to definitely save on, because it depends on a wide variety of factors. How much space do you have? What sort of PC are you running? And there's many other components to it. But let me just talk you through what I think are the most important aspects to consider before making that decision of what to buy and then how much to spend on that. Let's talk formats initially, and we'll do VR in a little bit. So we're just talking about monitors here. There's different selections you can make. You could go single screen, you could go triple screen, you could go single screen ultra wide. There are different panel sizes to think about. Do you want to do 27-inch? Do you want to do 32-inch? You know, typically those would be the two sizes that you'd look at if you're going for a more regular triple screen setup. There are all sorts of exotic ultra wide setups. But there's some things to think about. A single exotic ultra wide 49-inch, and they probably go quite a lot bigger than that now. These are really heavy pieces of equipment. So there's a huge amount to think about. But first of all, and I think the most important thing, is immersion, or just what type of sim rig are you trying to create? If you go single screen, even if this single screen is ultra wide, you've got to go into this eyes open. You won't be able to see out the side windows of the car when you're racing. That's just a fact. And you know, I think there's this sort of idea that the manufacturers that make the ultra wides, they often do now sit them in sim rigs as part of their advertising to say, hey, it's like wraparound immersion. And they are honestly fantastic. I have been through that evolution on my sim rig too. And you get more than a single screen that's 32-inch, but they don't wrap all the way around. You can probably see your left mirror, you know, because that's obviously usually the side of the car that you're sat in. So you can usually see that just about. You certainly won't see the right mirror, and you won't see your side windows. They don't wrap all the way around. So if you're looking at ultra wide, you know, maybe space is a constraining factor for you, and you know, you can fit an ultra wide, but you're not sure you can fit triples. Just understand the limitations that it will have. They also, you know, they do take a lot of processing power. If it's a 1440p ultra wide, it's not the same as running 1440p triples, but it's getting up there. So, you know, whatever resolution that you're running on either ultra wide or triples, you better be sure that you've got a GPU and a CPU and just an all-round PC build that's going to be able to drive those pixels effectively, because there really is no point spending a ton of money on screens unless you've got a computer that's got the horsepower in order to run them effectively for you. So let's say that you've considered single screen, you've considered ultra wides, but you really want to get into triples. You know, you've seen everyone's rigs online, they look pretty cool. I know that's exactly what got me into triples after going from single screen to ultra wide. You know, I eventually bit the bullet and went down that path. There are a few things to think about here as well. First of all would be panel size, 27-inch versus 32-inch. There's no right or wrong answer. Space might be a concern or consideration for you. You know, I've got a reasonable amount of space here, so I do run 32 inches. And you know, it's not like VR, obviously, where you're completely immersed in the picture. But for me, 27-inch, even if I have them very close to, you know, to my face and just kind of just behind the steering wheel, it still feels like a little bit letterbox. And that's the same complaint that I would have for most ultra wides as well, is they're great for sort of expanded FOV, but they're just a bit narrow in terms of their height. But if you're space constrained, or if budget is a concern, you can get some fantastic 27-inch monitors at both 1080p and often at 1440p as well. But let's talk about that. Let's talk about resolution. Again, if you're single screening, you know, the resolution is the resolution. My view, single screen 4K, given the cost, versus triple screen 1080p, I would go triple screen, because I think that immersion and sort of the visual clues you can get by seeing out the side is going to be way better. But of course, personal choice. But if you're looking at triples, be it 27-inch or 32-inch, then you're basically looking at 3 resolutions for each of those screens: 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. No issues with any of them. However, 1080p, you can run 1080p on a mid to low end system reasonably well. So that is something to bear in mind. If you're system constrained, but you really want to get that triple screen feel, you want to get that immersion, look at 27-inch 1080p monitors, because they can probably work for you. Let's say your system's got some juice behind it, and you really want to look at 1440p. You're going to get that clarity and visual quality, and honestly, it's a really nice step up from 1080p. The challenge for me with 1080p is often if you've got triples, they're reasonably close to your face, so you can kind of see the pixels on 1080p. So they don't look bad, but there's an obvious difference when you step up to 1440p triples, be it 27-inch or 32-inch. That visual quality really steps up. However, just bear in mind that's going to increase the requirements for your PC system. Going to need a very mid to high-end graphics card to run that. You know, in today's money, 4060s, 4070s, you know, something in that range to be able to run at acceptable frame rates in a range of conditions. And this is in iRacing, in ACC and some other titles where they're more demanding on the graphics. You know, you may have to bring the graphics down to get them to run. And then you've got the super exotic setup, which, you know, I moved to about a month ago, which is 4K triples. This in today's world is at the limit of what the GPU can put out. These are running at 4K, 120 hertz. They can actually run at 240, but the GPU cannot physically put out that refresh rate with this level of resolution across the triples. So if you really want to go exotic and you want to push it out there, I can tell you the visual fidelity on 4K screens is just fantastic. I ran 1440p for a long time. That was great too, but there is obviously a noticeable difference. But the challenges in getting this to work smoothly, for me being able to stream effectively, took weeks of troubleshooting and work, and you can feel you're really just pushing the sort of bleeding edge of what today's GPUs can do. There's a 4090 in here, and it is absolute at capacity, even overclocked a little to try and give me some more headroom. So when it comes to monitors, you can go down the rabbit hole, you can spend a ton of money, but monitors, you can't spend money alone. If you're going to go for triples, especially if you're going for triples at a 1440p or above, then you're also going to have to spend quite a bit of money on your PC system to be able to support that. But this is, again, it's not a bad place to save. You can get 27-inch triples in 1080p that will work just fine on kind of a medium PC system and just give you some fantastic immersion. So my guidance for this one is to spend, but only to spend to get the characteristics of the sim that you're looking for, and then just spend up to whatever budget you think makes sense. 1440p triples I think is a really good balance today in terms of the visual fidelity that you're going to get without having to break the bank on either the monitors or the PC to support it. 4K is wild, if you're going down that path, you're an enthusiast, enjoy it. I'm having a great time with mine. But if your choice is between an ultra wide, my recommendation is take a look at 1080p triples. See if the budget would work, because a high-end ultra wide that's 49 inches or wider isn't going to give you that full wraparound immersion. Yes, the quality may be slightly better, might be 1440p, but 1080p triples could absolutely be something to take a look at. It's not going to demand a higher end system to run them, but you are going to get that increased immersion. So it is worth doing your research. Try not to do what I did and go through every single iteration of monitors, single to ultra wide to triples, and then changing the resolution of triples. You never recoup your money, however good money you get from selling the monitors secondhand. But I do think there is no point spending a lot of money on a PC system, to then have the sort of visual quality not meet the needs for what you're looking for. But there's a ton of ranges out there. There's always great deals on Black Friday, on Boxing Day, and throughout the year. The second-hand market for monitors usually is pretty good. A lot of people are turning around old ones. Again, if you're going triples, just bear in mind you really want to have 3 monitors of the same type. It doesn't have to be that way, but it does make setup a little bit easier. So recommendation, yeah, this is an item to spend money on, but do your research and make sure you're just spending the amount to get the level of immersion that you're looking for. A quick note on virtual reality VR headsets. I have tried them in the past, but only ever really run them for a month or so. I had a Pimax, not sure how you say that, probably a year and a half ago. Tried it, sort of loved it, but it was heavy. It was so heavy when I was wearing it. I did love the immersion. Couldn't tell you if I was faster or slower. Probably didn't run it for long enough. But I just don't have a ton of experience with VR, so I'll leave that for other channels that kind of cover that in detail. But just the facts around VR, it's going to be like running triples, but probably even more demanding. It may be more like running triple 4K, I'm not sure, but it's going to be right up there. So you're going to need a reasonably powerful system to run it. And yeah, there are just the comfort elements, obviously if you're going to buy it in place of a monitor, great, but you are still going to need a monitor just for navigating about Windows, so you kind of have to double dip there even if you have a really cheap monitor setup. And if you do fully commit to VR, then that is your racing experience. You don't really want to be spending on VR and have triples as a backup. That's going to be a little bit on the luxury side. But that's really the key thing for VR. The technology is getting better, but they, just like triples, are pushing the limits of what today's GPUs can do. And there are many people that only, race in VR, and they absolutely love it. I race with a bunch of people who are in that camp, and they just can't speak highly of it enough. Maybe they've tried triples, but they're all about the VR and they love it. So I think if you can get an opportunity to try VR before going down that path, I think that's a really good thing to do, because it might not work for you. I like the immersion of it, but I do prefer triples, which kind of surprised me, because I'm all about trying to get the most immersive feeling, and having the true depth perception when you're in VR gives you that. But for me, the comfort, the weight of the headset, the sort of lower quality in terms of the visual fidelity, it's not quite as good when it's on triples. All of that was a bit of a concern, and so I returned my headset and I didn't stick with it. So I'm not really the expert, but again, it's probably going to be one that you would have to spend on, because you want to get the right quality headset so you get the good immersion when you're wearing it. But equally, you're going to have to spend on your PC to make sure it can drive the pixels that headset's going to demand. So before we close out, I want to just run through peripherals. So some of the smaller items, maybe not mandatory items, that you can add to the rig. I want to give you my perspective on where they add value and are worth spending, and maybe where they're not. So this is going to be super rapid fire, because there's many things that you can add to a sim rig setup. So I'm just going to hit the major ones. Some of the most obvious ones, handbrake would be key. I added a handbrake. After about 6 months of my first rig, I was in the Fanatec ecosystem. They had a handbrake. Oh man, I want to get that handbrake. That's going to be awesome. Got a rally game going, used it for about 2 weeks, never touched it after that. So, not saying handbrake's a bad idea, but are you going to use a game that requires a handbrake? So, definitely one to save on, unless you know for sure that is a piece of kit that you're going to need day in, day out. Because you know what? You can always just map a button as well to be a handbrake. Obviously not the same, not quite as cool, but unless you're honestly doing rally sims, any other sim that's going to be useful to have kind of an analog handbrake, just not needed. Sequential or H pattern shifters are another interesting one. Not quite as clear cut for me as a handbrake is. Again, in the Fanatec world, I had one of their, I can't remember the name of it, but it could be both a sequential and a H pattern shifter. And I did use it for both, mainly the H pattern when I was in rookies in iRacing in the MX-5. I loved it. I was using it to learn how to heel and toe. I felt like it really added to the immersion and realism. And I got out of rookies using that H shifter like week in, week out for months. And I really enjoyed that. And I probably do miss it a little bit that I don't have it now. I went through rookies again on the alt account and was using the paddles, and it totally didn't feel the same. And I did miss it a little bit. But that said, once I was out of rookies, how often did I use that H pattern shifter? Once in a blue moon, when I was just kind of having some fun. So again, unless you need a H pattern shifter, you're not going to require it to be able to run any sim. Maybe it's something to not buy right at the beginning when you set up your sim rig, unless you know that's exactly the sort of car that you're going to want to drive. But it would be one to put on the back burner and just to sit on for a while, just to see if you're going to buy it, or if you're going to need it. They feel like great things to have when you're showing off your rig, and people are like, oh wow, it's a H shifter, that's super cool. But if you're not going to use it, save that money. Put that money into better pedals, better anything, really, because otherwise it's just going to sit, look pretty, and you're not really going to get the value from it. Let's talk about butt kickers or LFE devices. I know you can't see it here. We'll run in some B-roll so I can show you what mine looks like. This item on my rig, I would say, has been the single best value for money that I have spent on my rig in the entire however many years that I've had it. And trust me, I've been through many upgrades, monitors, pedals, wheelbases, wheels. Unfortunately, I've been through far too many upgrade cycles. But one thing that has been a constant throughout, probably didn't have it for the first 3 months, but it didn't take me long, was a butt kicker. Now I did actually, I'm on my second iteration of it because the first one did eventually snap because I probably had it cranked quite high, and the design of it was the long butt kicker one, more designed for an office chair, so it wasn't ideal. The more modern designs are much more durable. But these aren't that expensive. They're in the hundreds of dollars range, and I imagine secondhand market's pretty good, but because of what they do with the vibrations, you've got to be aware that they will put some stress on the joints. So if you can get a new one, I think that's going to be better for longevity. And if you don't know what they do, they basically simulate when you're going over bumps and other track surfaces. iRacing has LFE built in, so you don't need any extra software to run. You just need to tell it which sound card and output the butt kicker is plugged into. So it's super easy to do. It's customizable, so you can increase the levels of certain components, bumps, gear changes, you can lessen others, so it's quite customizable. Even just the default setting for me is pretty solid. But the level of immersion for me was just dramatic overnight. It doesn't make me a faster driver, just to be clear, but in iRacing, you're getting real force feedback through that wheel of what you would feel in the wheel, but you're not necessarily getting anything from the suspension, so the bumps in the road or anything else. And that is where a butt kicker or any LFE device really comes in, and it adds that extra information, and the immersion that it provides from my perspective is enormous. Now if I ever start running without it on, I just immediately feel it and everything just feels off. It doesn't quite feel right. When I was running without it for a couple of months, when I'd broken one and I was waiting to get the new one, I just didn't enjoy it as much. I really missed it until I installed the new one. So this is an absolute definite spend item for me. If you're running one of the cheaper cockpits, just make sure there's a way to get it attached. For 80/20 aluminium rigs, they're fantastic on those because at least for me, I feel the vibration really does spread around the rig. I try and have it mounted right underneath my seat because that's kind of where I want to feel it. You can, of course, get additional ones and mount them around the pedals and, etc. Obviously adds complexity. For me, just a single one mounted under the seat gives me all the immersion I need. But as I said, I would absolutely spend here. You don't have to spend more than, $200 to $300, I think, to get a really good one with plenty of power. They're super easy to set up. And that extra information you get from the drive, for me, was transformative overnight. So out of everything that we've talked about today, this, I think, is the one place to spend money because it isn't all that expensive, but the immersion that it gives you for the money is fantastic. That's going to do it for this one. Sim rigs are complex beasts. Huge amount of personal preference, of course, goes into where you want to spend your money, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of guidance and you can learn a little bit from my mistakes in terms of where companies are trying to get you to spend money, but it might not give you the value that you're looking for, and other areas where maybe they're not talked about as much, but can have a huge impact in terms of the adaptability and longevity of whatever sim rig that you build. Next up will be similar content, but focused on PC hardware. Be a little bit shorter than this one. Gonna focus on which PC components, you might want to spend more on to get the most from a sim racing PC versus, general gaming. So I'm gonna talk through that. And as ever, setting up and running a sim rig is very much personal preference. I'd love to hear from you in the comments for those of you that agree with certain areas. And I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that would disagree. And there's different areas that you'd want to spend money in order to get the kind of best immersion for you. My overall guidance is just take your time to do the research. Try not to get suckered in too much to the marketing that's out there. There's great companies, there's great competition, there's a lot of great products, but sim racing is kind of getting expensive, to be honest, especially in the high end. So take the time to do your research and try and evaluate what is it that you need to get the most out of your sim racing setup, and therefore where's it going to make the most sense for you to spend your budget versus someone else, because no two sim rigs are the same and the way we use our sim rigs are different from one person to another, and therefore where we want to spend the money is going to differ, you know, from me, from you, to the next person. So just take the time to do that research. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next one.